At 9:30 at night, the ground beneath the Mantaro Valley in Peru started shaking, and it was dark. A shallow earthquake struck the Chupaca area of Junin region, inland, directly beneath densely populated communities, with an epicenter less than 16 miles below the surface. Within minutes, reports were coming in from locals. Collapsed homes, injured people, trapped individuals, power outages cutting off entire communities in the middle of the night. Urgent calls for help from villages in the epicentral zone. This is a developing situation, and the darkness is making everything worse. Subscribe and turn on notifications before we go further. Because the full picture of what happened in Peru tonight is still forming, aftershocks are already occurring, and the structural risk in the affected communities has not ended with the first shock. Let us start with the numbers, because they explain everything about why a magnitude that would be manageable in many countries is so alarming in this specific location. The USGS initially reported the earthquake at between magnitude 5.1 and 5.5. The moment tensor analysis, the scientific measurement of exactly how the fault moved, confirmed a depth of approximately 11.5 kilometers, just over 7 miles beneath the surface. That is extremely shallow for an inland crustal earthquake. The moment tensor also confirmed the fault type, almost pure reverse thrust movement, with a 90% double couple component, meaning the seismic energy was overwhelmingly consistent with ordinary tectonic slip on a fault rather than any other source. In plain terms, a compression fault beneath the Andes was locked, accumulated stress, and then suddenly slipped. One block of crust was thrust upward over the other.
Personal militar formado por aquí. Personal militar.
Viviendas no han colapsado. Están aquí todas las autoridades del sistema sanitario también. Vivienda. Están tapándose con...
Marita, nosotros vamos ayudando con
The energy from that movement reached the surface within seconds, and the communities sitting above it had almost no warning. The shaking intensity in the epicentral zone near Chupaca has been estimated at Modified Mercalli Intensity 7. That level of shaking is serious. It is powerful enough to crack weak structures, topple adobe walls,
aléjense de la pared, señor.
Corriendo con el... ¿Los puedes sacar?
bring down parts of homes, and trigger localized collapse, particularly in older rural construction that was never designed to resist seismic loading. In the Mantaro Valley, communities affected tonight are built primarily of adobe, the sun-dried mud brick construction that has been used across the Andean highlands for centuries. Adobe is one of the most vulnerable construction materials on Earth in an earthquake. It has almost no tensile strength. When the ground shakes, adobe walls crack, separate, and fall. They do not warn you. They do not flex. They collapse. This is why a magnitude 5.5, a number that many people associate with minor damage, is producing the reports currently coming in from Chupaca, Chongos Bajo, and the surrounding communities. Magnitude alone does not tell the story. Depth, fault type, soil conditions, and building quality together determine what actually happens to the people living above a rupture. Tonight in Peru, all of those factors combined against the communities in the epicentral zone. At 9:45 in the evening, 17 minutes after the main shock, the ground moved again. A magnitude 3.7 aftershock struck approximately 14 kilometers southwest of Chupaca, at a slightly shallower depth of 18 kilometers. On its own, a 3.7 is a minor event, but in the context of a damaging main shock that has already cracked walls, separated adobe blocks, and destabilized structures throughout the affected zone, even a smaller aftershock is genuinely dangerous. Buildings that absorb the main shock but remain partially standing are now compromised. Their walls are cracked, their foundations are shifted, their structural integrity is reduced to a fraction of what it was before 9/30. A magnitude 3.7 shaking those same structures again can complete what the main shock started.
Amables oyentes, el Nevado del Guaitapayana, por esta parte frontal, desde la vía.
This is the brutal compounding effect of earthquake sequences. The danger does not end with the first shock. In many cases, the aftershocks that follow over the next hours and days find a built environment that is far more vulnerable than it was before the sequence began. Now let us talk about the geology, because understanding what broke beneath the Mantaro Valley tells us about the ongoing risk in this part of Junin. The USGS moment tensor analysis points strongly toward the Altos del Mantaro fault zone as the likely source of this earthquake. This fault runs approximately northwest to southeast and dips toward the southwest, lying along the southwestern edge of the Mantaro Basin. It is a reverse fault, which means it accommodates the horizontal compression of the Andes as the South American continent continues to buckle and thicken under the forces generated by the subduction of the Nazca Plate to the west. The Andes are one of the most geologically active mountain ranges on Earth, built by exactly this process of crustal compression over millions of years. The subduction of the Nazca Plate beneath the South American plate along the Peru-Chile Trench is the engine that drives the uplift of the entire mountain chain. That process generates not only the large offshore megathrust earthquakes for which the Pacific coast of South America is known, but also a distributed network of crustal faults within the Andes themselves, faults that accommodate the internal deformation of the mountain range as it continues to grow. Tonight's earthquake was not a megathrust event. It was not a rupture of the deep Nazca slab. It was a shallow crustal earthquake inside the Andes, on a compression fault that lies directly beneath populated communities in the Mantaro Valley. The distinction matters because it means the energy from the rupture was focused precisely into the towns and villages above, without the geographical distance and geological depth that attenuates the shaking from offshore events. The Altos del Mantaro fault zone had not produced a well-documented major rupture in the historical record prior to tonight. That is not unusual for Andean crustal faults. Many of them are poorly characterized simply because they have not ruptured in the period during which scientific seismological monitoring has been available. The absence of a documented large historical earthquake on a fault does not mean the fault is inactive. It means it has been accumulating stress without releasing it in the recorded period, which is exactly the condition that precedes a sudden rupture when the stress finally exceeds the strength of the locked fault. The moment tensor analysis confirms that the Altos del Mantaro fault zone matches the compression direction of tonight's earthquake almost precisely. The southwest dipping reverse fault slipped. One block of crust was forced upward over the other. At only 7 miles depth, the energy had almost no geological buffer between the rupture and the surface, and the communities of Chupaca, Chongos Bajo, Pampona, and the surrounding Junin districts were directly above it. The reports from the epicentral zone reflect exactly what this combination of factors would predict: collapsed adobe homes, power outages as infrastructure failed, trapped individuals in the darkness, injured people waiting for emergency services that are navigating roads in an area where power is out and aftershocks continue, urgent messages from community members asking for help, describing damage that goes beyond what a moderate earthquake typically produces in a better prepared environment. Some of those messages include reports of fatalities, though those reports require official confirmation and should be treated carefully until verified. What is confirmed is that the shaking was strong enough in the epicentral zone to cause serious structural damage, that multiple individuals were reported trapped in collapsed structures, and that the situation in the hardest-hit communities was still developing as of the latest information available. The priority for emergency teams tonight is clear. First, search and rescue in the structures that have fully or partially collapsed, conducted under the added difficulty of darkness and power outages. Second, getting people out of damaged structures that are still partially standing before aftershocks finish what the main shock started.
Hey, aléjense de la pared, señor.
Third, assessing which roads in the affected area are passable, since the same ground shaking that damaged buildings can also crack road surfaces, trigger small landslides on cut slopes, and damage bridges, potentially isolating communities at exactly the moment when access for emergency services is most critical. And fourth, monitoring the seismic network for further aftershocks, because the stress released by the main shock redistributes to adjacent fault segments, and in a compression environment like the Andes, the fault system does not simply stop moving after one event. Peru sits in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The Pacific coast faces the ongoing threat of offshore megathrust earthquakes. The interior of the Andes faces the ongoing threat of crustal faults exactly like the one that ruptured tonight. The communities of the Mantaro Valley have lived with this reality for generations. What they did not have tonight was warning. A shallow reverse fault rupturing at 9:30 in the evening, in the dark, in communities built of adobe, with aftershocks already beginning 17 minutes later. The situation is still developing. The damage assessment is still ongoing, and the aftershock sequence has not ended. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the full story of what happened in the Mantaro Valley tonight is still being written.